The Rothschild family didn't just become wealthy. They invented a form of financial power that had never existed before, a private multinational banking network that could move capital and information across Europe faster than any government, that could finance wars and manipulate markets and influence policy in multiple countries simultaneously. And they did this in the space of about 2 generations. From Mayer Amschel Rothschild, a dealer in rare coins operating from the Jewish ghetto in Frankfurt in the 1760s, to his 5 sons who by the 1820s controlled banking houses in Frankfurt, London, Paris, Vienna, and Naples, coordinating their activities across borders, sharing information through private couriers, acting in concert to dominate government bond markets, and establishing a level of international financial integration that wouldn't be matched until the late 20th century. And what's remarkable isn't just the speed of their rise or the scale of their wealth, though. Both were extraordinary. It's how they did it. The specific innovations in organization and communication and strategy that allowed them to outcompete both older banking houses and sovereign states, creating a model of transnational financial power that persists in modified form today, though the Rothschilds themselves have long since faded from the commanding heights they once occupied. Their technique of coordinated international operations, of using information advantages and network effects to dominate markets, of being indispensable to governments while maintaining independence from any single government. This became the template for multinational finance. And understanding how they built this network reveals fundamental truths about how financial power works, how information advantages compound into market dominance, and how a family of outsiders, Jews in Christian Europe, used their marginal status and kinship bonds to create advantages that establishment bankers couldn't match. Mayer Amschel Rothschild was born in 1744 in the Frankfurt Judengasse, the Jewish ghetto, a single street where thousands of Jews were forced to live under humiliating restrictions. They couldn't own land outside the ghetto, couldn't hold most professions, couldn't appear in public on Sundays and Christian holidays, had to pay special taxes, wore identifying badges, faced periodic violence and expulsion. This was the legal and social status of Jews throughout most of Europe, tolerated but oppressed, allowed to exist but denied basic rights. And one of the few professions open to them was money lending and financial services, because Christians still had qualms about usury even after the theological restrictions had loosened. So Jews filled a role that was economically necessary but socially despised. And this created opportunity and constraint. Jews who became good at finance, who developed the skills and networks and reputation, could become valuable despite their subordinate status. And Mayer Amschel understood this. He started dealing in rare coins, which allowed him to interact with collectors and nobility. He cultivated a relationship with Crown Prince William of Hesse, who had inherited an enormous fortune and needed someone to manage it. And over decades, Mayer Amschel made himself indispensable, managing investments, arranging loans, providing financial services that the prince couldn't easily get elsewhere. And crucially, Mayer Amschel had 5 sons, and he trained them all in the business. And he had a vision that none of them would have separately, but together they could dominate European finance. And the vision was this: establish a son in each of the major financial centers of Europe, maintain the family as a coordinated unit, share information instantly through private couriers, act in concert to dominate government bond markets, and use the family network to do what no single bank could do: operate simultaneously in multiple countries, arbitraging differences, moving capital to where returns were highest, having information before competitors, and remaining loyal to family above all other considerations. The 5 sons were Amschel, who stayed in Frankfurt, Salomon, who went to Vienna, Nathan, who went to London, Karl, who went to Naples, and James, who went to Paris. And the timing was perfect. This was the era of the Napoleonic Wars, when European governments needed enormous loans to finance armies, when traditional tax revenues couldn't cover military spending, when the bond markets became crucial to state survival. And the Rothschilds positioned themselves to become the dominant players in these markets. The breakthrough came with the British government's need to finance the war against Napoleon. Britain was fighting a coalition war, subsidizing allies on the continent, and needed to transfer massive amounts of gold and currency to European battlefields. But this was difficult. France controlled much of Europe. Normal channels were cut off, and the Rothschilds, with their network of brothers across Europe, with their ability to move money through multiple jurisdictions, with their private couriers who could cross battle lines and navigate checkpoints. They could do what governments couldn't. They could transfer British gold to Wellington's army in Spain, to Austria and Prussia, to wherever Britain needed to pay troops or bribe allies. And they did this using bills of exchange, the medieval technique that had never been deployed at this scale. They'd convert pounds to francs or florins or whatever currency was needed, using their network to find the best rates, avoid French interference, and move vast sums faster and more reliably than any competitor. And this made them indispensable to the British treasury and enriched them enormously because they took a cut on every transaction. And because they had information from all over Europe, they knew which currencies and bonds to buy and sell. They could speculate on outcomes of battles before others knew the results, and this information advantage, combined with capital and network effects, allowed them to dominate. The famous story about Nathan Rothschild and Waterloo illustrates both the power of their information network and the mythology that grew around it. The legend says that Nathan, stationed in London, received news of Wellington's victory at Waterloo through his private courier network before the British government did, and that he used this information to manipulate the bond market, supposedly first selling bonds to make others think Britain had lost, causing prices to crash, then buying them at the bottom before the real news arrived, and making a fortune when prices rebounded. This story is probably exaggerated or false. The timing doesn't quite work, and there's little documentary evidence, but it became part of Rothschild mythology. And what's true is that the Rothschilds did have the best private intelligence network in Europe. They employed couriers and used carrier pigeons and coded messages and infiltrated government offices to get information faster than anyone else. And they absolutely used this information to trade, to position themselves ahead of market-moving news, to know which governments were stable and which were likely to default, which wars would be won and which lost. And this information advantage, maintained over decades, was worth more than any single trade. It allowed them to consistently outperform competitors, to take risks that others feared because they had better information about the actual risks, and it made them the go-to bankers for governments because governments wanted access to the Rothschilds' intelligence network. It was a symbiotic relationship where the Rothschilds gathered information to improve their trading and governments used Rothschild loans partly to access Rothschild information. The structure of the business was crucial to its success. The five brothers remained a partnership, not a corporation, and family loyalty was absolute. This wasn't sentimentality, it was business strategy, because trust was everything in 19th century finance. Most banking houses were partnerships where partners were fully liable for the firm's debts. So choosing partners was choosing people you trust with your financial life. And most banks struggled to expand internationally because trust didn't scale well. You couldn't just open a branch in another country and trust that whoever ran it wouldn't embezzle or make terrible decisions. But the Rothschilds solved this through kinship. A son in Vienna could be trusted absolutely, not because of contracts or oversight, but because family reputation was everything. Betraying the family was unthinkable, and this allowed them to operate as one firm across 5 countries, sharing capital, information, and risk, while competitors were fragmented, limited to operations in 1 or maybe 2 countries. The Rothschilds could shift resources instantly to wherever opportunity arose. If Austrian bonds were attractive, all 5 brothers could participate, pooling capital and sharing the returns. If French bonds were risky, they could coordinate to avoid exposure or demand higher yields, and this coordination gave them market power. They could dominate bond issues for European governments because they could commit more capital, distribute bonds across multiple markets, guarantee liquidity in ways that national banks couldn't match. The intermarriage strategy reinforced this structure. Rothschild cousins married each other, keeping wealth within the family and strengthening bonds across branches. Nathan's daughter married James's son. Salomon's daughter married Nathan's son. This wasn't unusual for dynastic families, but the Rothschilds practiced it systematically. Of the 58 marriages made by Mayer Amschel's grandchildren, at least half were to cousins. This concentrated ownership and control prevented dilution of the family fortune, ensured that all branches remained aligned. And it worked. The family operated as a unit for over a century. Longer than any other banking house maintained coherence and dominance. Most banking dynasties fragmented within 2 or 3 generations as children married out, disputed inheritances, took the money, and left the business. But the Rothschilds, through intermarriage and strong family culture, maintained unity much longer. And this was a huge competitive advantage. They could think and act long-term in ways that partnerships with unrelated members or corporations with dispersed shareholders couldn't. They could sacrifice short-term profit in one branch to benefit the whole, could maintain reserves and avoid over-leveraging, could preserve reputation above all, because reputation was family name and family name was everything. The Rothschilds dominated government bond markets in the 19th century in a way no private institution has dominated a major market since. When European governments needed to borrow, they came to the Rothschilds. Not always. They had competitors, but the Rothschilds handled the largest and most important issues: British bonds, French bonds, Austrian bonds, Prussian bonds, even American bonds in the 1830s and 40s, and they controlled not just the issuance but the secondary markets. They'd buy bonds from governments at a discount, then distribute them through their network, selling to investors across Europe, making markets to provide liquidity, and because they controlled both issuance and secondary trading, they could manipulate prices, could support bonds of governments they favored and punish governments that displeased them, and this gave them political influence. Governments needed access to credit, needed their bonds to trade at good prices, and the Rothschilds could affect both. Not through military force or formal political power, but through market power, through control of the mechanism by which governments finance themselves. This was a new form of power, financial power exercised across borders, not subject to any single government's control, but influencing all of them. And it made the Rothschilds perhaps the most powerful family in Europe for several decades in the mid-19th century. Not officially, they held no titles of nobility in most countries, though they eventually got some. They commanded no armies, but they could make or break governments through their control of credit. The famous quote attributed to various Rothschilds, "Give me control of a nation's money, and I care not who makes its laws," probably apocryphal, captures the reality of their power. They didn't need to make laws because they controlled something more fundamental: access to credit. And in an era when states constantly needed to borrow, when tax systems were inefficient and military spending was enormous, when government bonds were the primary mechanism of state finance, controlling bond markets was controlling states. Not absolutely. Governments could default or find other lenders or confiscate property, but the costs of antagonizing the Rothschilds were usually higher than accommodating them. And so the Rothschilds got what they wanted more often than not: trading privileges, legal protections for Jews in various countries, influence over policy. They didn't dictate policy, but they shaped the parameters within which policy operated. Governments knew that if they wanted to borrow at good rates, they needed to maintain good relations with the Rothschilds, and this constrained what governments could do, limited their options, and this was power, exercised subtly and indirectly, but very real. The decline of Rothschild dominance came gradually through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, for multiple reasons that reveal the limitations of their model. First, other banking houses learned from them, copied their techniques. J.P. Morgan and other American banks built international networks. The Warburgs and other German Jewish banks competed. So the Rothschilds lost their monopoly on international coordination. Second, technology reduced their information advantage. The telegraph and later telephone meant that information traveled faster than private couriers, eliminating the days or weeks of advantage the Rothschilds had enjoyed. By the late 19th century, everyone knew about battles and political changes almost immediately, so the Rothschilds' intelligence network was less valuable. Third, the rise of central banks and government debt management offices meant that states could manage their own bond issuance more effectively, didn't need private bankers as intermediaries as much. Fourth, the scale of finance outgrew what even the Rothschilds could handle. World War I borrowing was so enormous that it required state coordination and multiple banking syndicates. No single family could finance modern industrial war. Fifth, and perhaps most fundamentally, the family structure that had been an advantage became a disadvantage. Partnerships couldn't raise capital from outside investors, couldn't grow as fast as corporations, and keeping everything within the family meant limiting talent to family members, some of whom were brilliant, but others were merely competent or worse. whereas corporations could hire the best talent regardless of family. And as finance became more complex and specialized, this mattered more. The World Wars devastated the Rothschilds' European operations. The Vienna house was destroyed by the Nazis. The family fled. The Frankfurt house had already closed. The Paris house was confiscated. Only the London house survived intact. And after World War II, when the family tried to rebuild, they found the world had changed. Finance was dominated by American banks and later by Anglo-American giants like Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan. The Rothschilds remained wealthy and maintained a banking business, but they were no longer dominant. Were perhaps not even in the top tier. They'd become a historical curiosity, a name associated with 19th century power, but not 20th century finance. And this decline from dominance to irrelevance, from being the most powerful banking family in the world to being merely one wealthy family among many. This shows both the contingency of financial power and the limits of the family partnership model. The Rothschilds built the first global financial network, but they couldn't adapt that network to 20th century conditions, couldn't make the transition from partnership to corporation, from family business to modern institution. And so they were displaced, not destroyed but diminished, and their techniques were adopted by others who could deploy them at larger scale with corporate resources. The mythology around the Rothschilds is worth examining because it reveals anxieties about financial power and about Jews. During their dominance in the 19th century, the Rothschilds were subject to anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, claims that they secretly controlled governments, manipulated wars, exploited Christians. These theories mixed real facts about Rothschild power with anti-Semitic tropes about Jewish conspiracy and greed, and they persisted and evolved in the 20th century. Nazi propaganda seized on the Rothschilds as symbols of Jewish financial power that supposedly enslaved nations. And even today, conspiracy theories about the Rothschilds circulate online, claiming they control central banks or orchestrate historical events. These theories are nonsense. The Rothschilds are wealthy, but not uniquely so. They have no special control over governments or financial systems. They're one family among many in global finance. But the persistence of these theories shows how financial power, especially when exercised by outsiders or minorities, generates suspicion and resentment. People could see that the Rothschilds had power, could observe them influencing bond markets and advising governments. And in an era when financial mechanisms were opaque to most people, this power seemed mysterious and sinister, and anti-Semitism provided a ready-made explanation. Jews were foreigners, untrustworthy, working together against Christians, and the Rothschilds real. Success became evidence for anti-Semitic fantasies about Jewish world domination. This was tragic because it took a genuine business success story, a family that through skill and innovation and hard work built something unprecedented and turned it into fuel for hatred. The real lesson of the Rothschilds isn't about conspiracy. It's about how financial networks create power. The Rothschilds built the first truly global banking network by solving problems that had constrained previous bankers. The trust problem through family, the communication problem through private couriers and later technology adoption, the coordination problem through partnership structure and shared information, and the access problem by making themselves indispensable to governments. They identified that government bond markets were the crucial nexus where they could deploy their advantages, where international coordination and information and capital all mattered, where they could compete not on local knowledge, where established banks had advantages, but on global integration, where they were unique, and they dominated this space for decades. But their success contained the seeds of decline. The family partnership model that enabled initial coordination limited later growth. The focus on government bonds that brought wealth and power in the 19th century became less important as corporate finance and industrial lending grew in the 20th. The information advantages that compounded into dominance were eroded by technology, and the very visibility of their success made them targets, both for anti-Semitic hatred and for competitors who studied their methods and copied what worked while avoiding the limitations of family structure. Modern global banks are Rothschild descendants in technique, if not lineage. Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan and other giants operate internationally, coordinate across borders, use information advantages, position themselves as indispensable to governments and corporations. The difference is scale and structure. Modern banks are corporations, not partnerships, operate in dozens of countries, not 5. Employ thousands, not hundreds. But the basic logic is Rothschild logic: build network effects. Control key nexuses of financial flows. Maintain information advantages. Be so embedded in the system that your failure would be catastrophic, and therefore you must be supported. This is too big to fail before the phrase existed. The Rothschilds were too important to fail in the 19th century. Governments couldn't let them collapse because the bond markets would have seized up. And modern global banks occupy the same position. Their Rothschild technique of making themselves indispensable has been refined and scaled up, but it's fundamentally the same strategy, and the political consequences are similar. Unease about financial power exercised across borders by institutions not fully controlled by any government. Conspiracy theories about bankers secretly controlling the world, periodic backlash, and calls for regulation or breakup. And yet the system persists because the functions these institutions perform are necessary. Someone has to move capital internationally. Someone has to make markets in government debt. Someone has to coordinate financial flows across jurisdictions, and the institutions that figure out how to do this accumulate power, just as the Rothschilds did 2 centuries ago. The Rothschilds' rise also shows how outsider status can be an advantage in finance. The same marginalization that restricted Jews to certain professions created opportunities, because Jews across Europe maintained connections with each other, spoke common languages, had kinship networks that crossed borders, so they were positioned to build international businesses in ways that Christians embedded in national hierarchies weren't. A Christian banker in Paris was French first, his loyalties and connections were French, but a Jewish banker in Paris, legally French but socially marginal, could maintain connections to Vienna or London or Frankfurt without seeming disloyal, because he wasn't fully part of any national community. And this marginality, this position between communities, allowed for coordination that couldn't happen within communities. The Rothschilds exploited this. Their Jewish identity was a disadvantage in many ways, subjected them to restrictions and prejudice, but it was also an advantage. It allowed them to build a transnational network at a time when transnational institutions were rare, and this pattern repeats. Many of the great international banking families of the 19th and early 20th centuries were Jewish. Warburgs, Barings, Sassoons, Lehman Brothers, all used transnational connections that came from marginal status, and more broadly, immigrants and outsiders are overrepresented in finance, because finance is about connections and information and trust. And people who bridge communities have advantages in building these. They can access networks that insiders can't or don't think to access, and this advantage compounds over time. The first global financial network that the Rothschilds built was unprecedented, but it wasn't permanent. They built it in a specific historical moment when technology and politics and family structure aligned to create opportunity. They exploited that opportunity brilliantly. They became perhaps the most powerful family in the world for several decades. But they couldn't maintain it because the conditions that enabled their rise changed. Technology eroded their information advantages. Corporate structure proved superior to family partnership for scaling. And the world wars and Holocaust destroyed much of what they'd built. What persists is not Rothschild dominance, but the model they created. The idea that financial power can be global while political power remains national. That coordinated international operations create advantages that purely national firms can't match. That information and networks and trust are the basis of financial power. And that making yourself indispensable to governments, so embedded in the system that your failure would cause systemic crisis, is the ultimate form of financial security. These insights, which the Rothschilds discovered and demonstrated through their success, are now commonplace. They're the operating principles of modern global finance. And in that sense, the Rothschilds, though diminished as a family and no longer dominant as an institution, succeeded beyond what they could have imagined. They didn't just build a business, they built a template. And that template, refined and adapted by others, structures how global finance works today, from Goldman Sachs to BlackRock to the international banking system that moves trillions daily across borders. All of it descending in some way from the network that 5 brothers built across Europe 200 years ago, making themselves indispensable to governments desperate for credit, using family bonds to create trust that transcended borders, deploying information advantages that compounded into market dominance, and demonstrating that financial power, while less visible than military or political power, can in certain circumstances be more consequential, because whoever controls credit controls what governments can do, and whoever moves capital across borders controls something that no single government controls, and that form of power. Transnational financial power exercised by private institutions. That's the Rothschilds' legacy, not the conspiracy theories or the mythology, but the actual historical achievement of showing how such power could be built and wielded, and how it would eventually be taken up by others who could deploy it at even greater scale, turning the Rothschilds' innovation into the foundation of the global financial system we inhabit today.